The rain over the dense canopy of the Schwarzwald did not fall, it suffocated. It was late autumn, 1944, and the sky had remained the color of a wet slate shingle for 14 days. Beneath the ancient pine boughs, where the moss grew thick and black over granite roots, the air smelled of ozone, rotting needles, and the sharp, chemical tang of high-explosive propellant. The mud was deep, a thick, cold slurry that clung to leather and iron alike, slowing the march of empires to a grinding, agonizing crawl. For miles in every direction, the black trees stood like rows of silent sentinels, witnessing the slow, agonizing death of a continent that had spent 5 years tearing itself to pieces. Colonel Matthew Finn stood upon a wet granite ridge overlooking the deep gorge of the Enns River. He did not use standard military binoculars. The glass lenses would only distort the fragile, failing world he forced his mind to reconstruct every morning. To his left, the landscape was a smear of vibrant, bleeding crimson where the high-pressure sodium lamps of the German border checkpoint cut through the rolling mountain mist. To his right, the American lines lay buried deep within the dark valleys, a gray, formless void where individual men, trucks, and artillery batteries were reduced to shivering, nameless silhouettes against the damp earth. His eyes, the color of skimmed milk at the irises, flickered with a rhythmic, involuntary twitch. Left, right, left. The nystagmus was always worse when the winter cold settled deep into his cheekbones, causing his vision to shake like a handheld camera in a gale. It was an oscillation born of a rotting macular core, an incurable, progressive genetic decay that was slowly, systematically eating the very center out of his world. Because of his incomplete achromatopsia and astigmatism, he lived in a world without solid borders. If he looked directly at the German checkpoint, the swastika flags were not red and black. They were a violet-gray bruise that pulsated violently against the yellow glare of the searchlights. Colors did not separate cleanly for him. They bled across edges like ink on wet parchment, defining themselves only by the harshness of their contrast. The brighter the light, the more the world became a blinding, expressionistic painting where edge and form melted away entirely into a wash of brilliant glare. "They are moving the armor across the lower pontoon, Matthew," a low voice whispered from the wet brush behind him. The voice belonged to Thomas Finn, though the men of the Office of Strategic Services had taken to calling him fledgling in their official reports. He was barely 19, his face still holding the soft, unblemished lines of their mother's side of the family, but his hands were already ruined by the knurling of machine pistol grips and the heavy grease of experimental ordnance. He wore a modified American paratrooper jacket, its national insignias and division patches aggressively sliced away with a combat knife, leaving only frayed olive threads where the Screaming Eagle once sat. He did not look like an American soldier anymore. He looked like a scavenger of the battlefield, a ghost born from the wreckage of the line. "I don't need to see the tanks, Tommy," Matthew said, his voice flat, carrying the dry, rhythmic rasp of a man who had smoked 3 packs of Lucky Strikes a day since the landings at Sicily. "I can hear the torsion bars straining on the wet mud. It's the 2nd SS Panzer Division. They're heavy. They're idling their engines because they're waiting for us. The brass back in London thinks we're clearing the enfilade," Thomas murmured, checking the breech of his custom M3 grease gun, a weapon he had personally modified in a basement workshop in London. He had fitted it with a dual-stage recoil spring and a shortened, perforated barrel that allowed him to cycle rounds at a terrifying 900 beats per minute. He sat low on his heels, his long legs tucked beneath him, resting on the mechanical, spring-loaded steel braces he had bolted directly to the frames of his combat boots. The small hydraulic pistons hissed softly as he shifted his weight against the mud. "They think we're opening the door for the infantry division to advance." "London thinks what the paper tells them to think," Matthew replied, his gloved fingers reaching into his heavy wool trench coat. His hand traced the contours of his custom monocle, a heavy, brass-rimmed assembly of 4 distinct, rotating polarized lenses. He snapped the frame over his right eye with a practiced, metallic click. With a sharp twist of the outer bezel, the blinding glare of the German searchlights was choked down from a white wash to a dull, high-contrast violet. The silhouettes of the German Tiger tanks below became suddenly sharp, distinct black cutouts against the pale, shimmering surface of the river. "We aren't opening a door for anyone, Tommy. We're closing it behind us." Behind them, the rest of the unit moved through the fog with the synchronized, silent efficiency of a single, well-oiled engine. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had spent 3 years operating in the blackest sectors of the war, where a single spoken word meant a mortar strike or an ambush. They were the Crows, and they had already flown beyond the reach of the flags they used to serve. Margaret, Midnight, Vance was leaning against a moss-covered boulder, her fingers idly tracing the edge of an American-issue trench knife. The weapon had a triangular blade designed to puncture lungs without making a sound, a tool of absolute utility. She wore a dark, specialized rubberized suit under her tattered winter gear, an experimental diving fabric she had stolen from a Navy depot in Norfolk before their transport crossed the Atlantic. Around her waist hung 8 heavy, black iron canisters filled with a proprietary chemical compound that, when ignited, didn't just produce smoke, it choked out the very transmission of light and sound waves through the air, creating a localized pocket of absolute, terrifying silence. Further back, in a clearing where the trees had been cleared by a stray artillery shell, sat Donald Carrion Vance, Margaret's distant cousin by blood, but her brother by trade. He was a mountain of a man, his chest encased in an experimental flak vest made of overlapping, hardened steel plates that rattled like iron feathers whenever he took a breath. On his back was a prototype 60-pound portable mortar system, its baseplate reinforced with hydraulic shock absorbers so he could fire it from his hip if the need arose. He was oiling the thread of a high-explosive round, his eyes wide and vacant, fixated on the way the grease caught the faint purple light filtered through Matthew's lenses. "They're late," Donald grunted, his voice a low bass rumble that vibrated in the soles of Thomas's boots. "The Germans. If they don't open the gate in 3 minutes, I'm going to level that guardhouse anyway." "Quiet, Donald," Margaret whispered without looking up from her blade. "The wind is carrying toward the valley. If the American pickets hear your mouth, they'll drop white phosphorus on this ridge before we can even cross the wire." "Let them," a fifth voice hissed from the dark. It was Dr. Jonathan Reyes, the man the unit had begun to call Scarecrow. He was crouched over a canvas field kit that smelled intensely of formaldehyde and ether. His fingers were long, thin, and wrapped in stained medical tape. Half of his jaw was held together by a crude, silver-plated wire apparatus, the result of a piece of shrapnel from Anzio that he had extracted himself without anesthesia in a ruined church. The human nervous system performs beautifully under the threat of thermal burning. The adrenaline spike would make the march down the mountain twice as efficient. Matthew Finn turned slowly, his boots sinking an inch into the wet moss. His nystagmus gave his gaze an eerie, flickering quality, as if he were constantly looking through a picket fence at a speeding train. "We don't need adrenaline, Doctor. We need precision. Are the serum packs ready?" Scarecrow patted the side of his leather medical satchel. Inside, glass ampules clinked against one another, a dark, amber fluid synthesized from ergot fungus and German synthetic amphetamines. It was a neurostimulant designed to expand the peripheral vision while inducing an acute state of hyperfocus, though the side effects included severe auditory hallucinations and eventual cardiac necrosis. "They're stable, Colonel. Enough to keep the entire unit operational for 48 hours without sleep, even if the lungs are full of mustard gas." "Good," Matthew said. He looked back down at the gorge. The defection of the Crow unit was not an act of political desperation. It was a cold, calculated betrayal of an empire they believed had outgrown its own morality. For 3 years, Finn's unit had been the hidden edge of the Allied advance across North Africa and into Europe. They were the ones who cleared the villages before the cameras arrived. They were the ones who buried the bodies of partisan leaders who grew too independent for Washington's liking. They had seen the blueprints for the post-war world, a world carved up by bureaucrats and corporate syndicates who had never smelled a trench or buried a brother in the rain. 3 weeks prior, while stationed in a liberated chateau near Nancy, Matthew had intercepted a diplomatic pouch intended for a high-ranking OSS official. Inside were the provisional maps of post-war Europe. There was no mention of liberation. There was only the redistribution of industrial sectors, the allocation of mineral rights in the Ruhr Valley, and an explicit order to allow specific German research facilities, those working on biological toxins and ballistic rocketry, to be captured with their staff intact, while the common soldiers who defended them were to be systematically worked to death in coal mines to stabilize the regional economy. Among those documents was a specific addendum regarding the Crow unit itself. Under the heading Operation Terminus, the document detailed the decommission of Finn's squad upon the cessation of hostilities. Because of their highly specialized psychological profiles and unorthodox tactical methodologies, they were deemed unintegrable into a peacetime military. The order was signed by a 3-star general in Washington. Upon the fall of Berlin, the Crows were to be reassigned to an island outpost in the Pacific that was scheduled to be used as a test site for a new, high-yield atomic ordnance. They were to be erased by their own creators, wiped from the ledger like a bad debt. They wanted us to die for a peace we wouldn't be allowed to see, Matthew said to the group, his voice cutting through the patter of the rain like a razor through silk. They want a world of filing cabinets and clerks. A world where the soldier is nothing but a spent cartridge to be swept into the dirt after the hunting is done. We are not cartridges. We are the hunters. And the Germans? Margaret asked, her eyes reflecting the cold yellow glare of the checkpoint below. They aren't clerks, Matthew. They're monsters. They are an engine, Matthew replied, adjusting the second lens on his monocle. The world shifted from purple to an oily, metallic green. An engine that needs drivers. Berlin is desperate. They have lost their eastern oil fields, their cities are rubble. Their armies are retreating on every front. They don't have the luxury of ideology anymore. They need ghosts. They need men who can kill without an army behind them. We will give them their ghosts, and in return, we will take their factories, their steel, and their secrets. When the world burns itself out, the Crows will be the ones who inherit the ash. Suddenly, a long, high-pitched whistle cut through the dark, 3 short blasts followed by one sustained note. It was the call of a European nightjar, but the cadence was wrong. It was a signal from their 6th member, Feathered Crow, who had spent the last 6 hours perched 400 feet above them on the rusted iron framework of an abandoned forestry fire tower. The patrol has passed, Thomas said, his legs tensing as the pneumatic pistons on his boots clicked into their locked positions. The Americans have rotated the watch on the western perimeter. We have a 7-minute window before the searchlight swings back to the logging trail. Move, Matthew commanded. The descent down the north face of the gorge was a masterclass in tactical stealth that no standard military manual could record. Thomas moved first. He did not walk. He launched himself. The spring-loaded steel stilts built into his trousers allowed him to clear 15 feet of wet scree in a single, silent leap. He caught the branch of an ancient oak, swung his body through the air with the grace of a trapeze artist, and dropped into the deep mud of the valley floor without making more than a wet thud. His grease gun was raised, the perforated silencer tracking the empty logging road ahead. He was the vanguard, his young eyes clear and sharp, scanning the dark for the tripwires and glass-cased landmines the Germans left behind like lethal seeds. Behind him came Margaret, a literal shadow among shadows. She pulled 2 of her blackout canisters from her belt and struck the chemical igniters against her thigh. A thick, heavy, violet-tinted grease began to ooze from the vents, dropping to the earth where it instantly sublimated into a dense, oily cloud that didn't rise. It slithered along the ground, filling the ravines and hollows. Within seconds, the sound of the rain against the leaves began to muffle, then vanished entirely. Inside Margaret's fog, the laws of acoustics seemed to warp. A man could scream 5 feet away and it would sound like a whisper from across a lake. She moved through this artificial silence like a scalpel, her boots wrapped in thick layers of felt and oiled leather, her knives held ready to throat any sentry who wandered into the dark. Matthew walked in the center of the column, his long wool coat trailing through the wet ferns. His left eye remained closed to preserve what little night vision he had left. His right eye, behind the multi-layered brass monocle, tracked the world as a shifting grid of light levels. He could see Donald's massive silhouette 60 yards back, the heavy steel plates of the carrion armor glowing a faint, cold blue in the ambient infrared spectrum that his modified lenses were designed to capture. He could hear Dr. Reyes's breath, shallow, rhythmic, punctuated by the faint clicking of the wire in his broken jaw. "Halten!" A voice barked from the brush 20 yards to their right. It was a German picket line, a 3-man machine gun nest hidden beneath a canvas tarpaulin, their MG-42 machine gun aimed down the logging road. They hadn't seen the Crows, but the sudden, unnatural silence of Margaret's fog had alerted the veteran sergeant in charge. Before the German soldier could cycle the bolt of his Mauser rifle, Thomas Finn was already in the air. The pistons on his legs compressed with a sharp, pneumatic hiss snap, launching him over the top of the machine gun nest. He didn't fire his weapon. The noise would risk the larger operation. Instead, he landed directly on the shoulders of the German sergeant, the steel heels of his combat stilts driving the man's face into the iron receiver of the MG-42 with a sickening crunch of bone. The remaining 2 German soldiers scrambled backward, but the dark fog had already enclosed them. One of them pulled a flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. To a normal man, the sudden beam of a 100-candle-power flashlight in a pitch-black forest would be a temporary distraction. To Matthew Finn, it was an invitation. The moment the white light hit his polarized monocle, the world exploded into an intense, burning violet landscape. Through his incomplete achromatopsia, the beam didn't look like a line of light. It looked like a solid, glowing pillar that illuminated every particle of moisture in the air. His nystagmus stabilized for a fraction of a second as his brain processed the extreme contrast. He drew his sidearm, a massive, custom-built Colt 1911 chambered in .45 ACP, fitted with an experimental 8-inch baffle silencer that made the weapon look like a target pistol. He fired 3 times. The sound was nothing more than 3 sharp, dry coughs, chack, 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 muffled further by the acoustic deadening properties of Margaret's smoke. The first round took the German with the flashlight through the center of his throat, severing the vocal cords before he could scream. The second and third rounds struck the last soldier in the sternum, the heavy lead slugs shattering his ribs and driving him back into the mud where he lay still, his boots twitching once before his nervous system failed. "Clear," Thomas whispered over the short-range radio link, his voice a series of rhythmic clicks into his throat microphone. The unit did not stop to plunder the bodies. They moved past the dead Germans without a glance, their boots splashing through the dark blood that was already being washed away by the relentless rain. 10 minutes later, they reached the perimeter of the German checkpoint. The installation was a formidable barrier, 2 parallel lines of 10-foot-tall barbed wire, separated by a 30-yard death strip of mined sand that had been raked smooth to show footprints. Every 50 yards stood a concrete bunker with a steel-reinforced slit for an MG-42, and the entire area was bathed in the harsh, flickering glare of 3 large, tripod-mounted carbon arc searchlights positioned on the roofs of the main barracks. At the center of the wire sat a heavy, steel-plated gate, its barricade arm held down by a massive iron counterweight. A dozen German soldiers stood outside the guardhouse, their winter coats buttoned to their chins, their hands tucked into their armpits to stay warm. They were not relaxed. Their eyes scanned the dark forest with the anxious vigilance of men who knew the front line was closing in from the east and the west. Matthew stood at the edge of the tree line, his monocle clicked to its 3rd setting, a high-contrast amber that turned the white searchlights into dull, unpainted discs. He could see the commander of the checkpoint, an Oberstleutnant named von Western, standing under the awning of the guardhouse, checking a gold pocket watch by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Donald," Matthew murmured into his throat mic. "The searchlight towers. Remove the visibility." "With pleasure, Colonel," Carrion Crow replied. He dropped to one knee in the wet moss, his heavy flak vest clattering against his thighs. With practiced, brutal efficiency, he unhitched the prototype mortar from his harness and set the baseplate into the earth. He didn't use a leveling bubble or a sight. He had fired 10,000 rounds from this specific tube across 3 continents. He knew the weight of the steel by the strain in his shoulders. He slid a specialized round down the smooth-bore barrel. It wasn't an explosive shell. It was a custom-loaded canister filled with liquid phosphorus and magnesium flakes, fused to detonate 20 feet above the ground. Thump! The mortar tube kicked back against its hydraulic cylinders, throwing a small ring of gray smoke into the rain. 3 seconds later, the sky above the central searchlight tower split open with a blinding, terrifying flash of blue-white fire. The magnesium burned at over 3,000 degrees, instantly melting the glass lenses of the searchlights and igniting the timber roofs of the guard towers below. The German soldiers shouted in panic, several of them throwing their hands over their eyes as the intense glare scorched their retinas. To men with normal vision, the sudden flash was a blinding wall of white that left them helpless in the dark that followed. But to Matthew Finn, the world had just become perfectly clear. The white-hot glare of the burning magnesium lit up the checkpoint like the midday sun, but through his achromatopsia and his polarized monocle, the scene was translated into a sharp, monochromatic map of absolute black and brilliant silver. The panicking German soldiers were no longer hidden by the rain or the shadows. They were distinct, dark statues standing against a burning white canvas. "Go," Matthew said. The crows struck the checkpoint not like an infantry squad, but like a localized natural disaster. Thomas was the first through the wire. He reached the 30-yard death strip and jumped. The pneumatic pistons on his legs gave a loud, metallic shriek as they discharged, carrying him 40 feet through the air, completely clearing the minefield. He landed on the roof of the concrete bunker, drew 2 combat knives from his belt, and dropped through the open steel hatch into the machine gun nest below. A second later, the muffled sound of a submachine gun firing in a confined space echoed from the bunker's firing slits, followed by the wet thump of bodies falling against concrete. Margaret followed in his wake, her smoke canisters converting the burning perimeter into a surreal, violet nightmare where the fire from the towers could not penetrate. She moved along the wire, her triangular blade finding the soft flesh beneath the helmets of the German guards who were running blindly through the mist. She killed with a rhythmic, detached economy of movement, a hand over the mouth, a swift pull across the carotid, a brief hold until the body went limp, then on to the next. Donald didn't bother with stealth. He walked down the center of the logging road, his heavy flak armor absorbing 3 stray rounds from a German pistol with nothing more than a succession of loud, metallic clangs. He reached the steel-plated gate, grabbed the iron counterweight with both hands, and with a roar that drowned out the sound of the burning towers, he tore the mechanism from its mountings, twisting the heavy iron tracks like wet cardboard. Within 4 minutes, the entire 12-man garrison of the checkpoint lay dead or dying in the mud. The Oberstleutnant, von Western, was the only one left alive. He had been thrown to the ground by the blast of Donald's mortar, his uniform scorched and his face covered in gray soot. He scrambled backward against the wall of the guardhouse, his hand trembling as he tried to draw his Walther P38 pistol from its leather holster. A heavy, spit-shined combat boot stepped on his wrist, pinning it to the muddy gravel with enough force to crack the small bones in his arm. Von Western looked up, his eyes wide with horror. Standing over him was Matthew Finn. The American colonel's heavy wool trenchcoat was soaked with rain and stained with German blood. His brass monocle catch caught the reflection of the dying magnesium fire, making his right eye look like a burning, golden coin. The left eye, cloud white and unfocused, twitched rhythmically in its socket. What are you?" Von Western gasped in broken English, his teeth chattering from shock and the cold. "Are you, the Vanguard? The American Army. They are not supposed to be within 10 miles of this sector." "The American Army doesn't know we're here, Oberstleutnant," Matthew said, his voice flat, devoid of anger or triumph. He reached down, grabbed the German officer by the collar of his tunic, and lifted him to his feet with one hand. "And they won't know where we've gone until the ink is dry on their treaty." From the shadows behind Matthew, the rest of the crows materialized. Thomas stood on his steel stilts, his face smeared with grease and cordite. Margaret was wiping the blade of her knife on a dead soldier's coat. Donald stood with his mortar resting on his shoulder like a log, and Dr. Reyes was already knelt over one of the wounded German guards, his long fingers methodically searching the man's pockets for experimental medical supplies. Von Western looked at the rogue unit, his eyes tracking the missing insignias on their uniforms, the American weapons, the cold, dead expressions in their eyes. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He knew the look of men who had crossed a line from which there was no return. "You are defecting," Von Western whispered, a strange, terrible realization dawning on his face. "You are turning your coats. For Berlin? Berlin is a tomb, American. The Reich is dead. In 6 months, the Russians will be flying their flag over the Reichstag. Why would you join a corpse?" Matthew Finn pulled his monocle from his face. Without the lenses, his failing eyes drifted, his pupils dilating as they tried to find focus in the bleeding, purple twilight of the burning checkpoint. He leaned in close to the German officer, so close that Von Western could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the fine, red veins that had shattered across his white irises. "We aren't joining your Reich, Oberstleutnant," Matthew said softly, his voice carrying the weight of an iron door closing forever. "We are joining your war. Your leaders are finished, but your weapons, your laboratories, and your hatred, those are going to outlive us all. Tell your commanders in Stuttgart that the crows have arrived. And tell them we brought our own black feathers." Matthew turned away, his heavy coat snapping in the wind as he walked past the shattered gate and into the dark territory of the Axis powers. "Kill the lights, Margaret," his voice floated back through the rain. "The Americans will be sending a scout car when they notice the radio silence. Let's make sure they find nothing but ghosts." Margaret Vance struck her final 2 canisters. Within seconds, a thick, impenetrable wave of silent, black smoke rolled over the checkpoint, swallowing the burning towers, the dead men, and the six figures who had just rewritten the history of the world in the mud of the Black Forest. The blackness did not merely cover the physical space of the checkpoint, it settled inside the lungs of the dying men who remained, a suffocating, soundless blanket that smelled faintly of pine gum and coal tar. Outside the perimeter of the smoke, the forest went entirely still. The constant downpour of the autumn rain turned into a distant, soundless vibration against the earth. For 40 seconds, the only dynamic element on the road was the slow, rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath 6 pairs of boots moving in perfect, clinical alignment toward the east. They did not look back at the ruin they had made, nor did they look forward to the lines they were about to cross. Their eyes were fixed on the narrow, unlit corridor of the forestry road that cut deeper into the heart of the German defensive line. As the last echoes of the burning magnesium tower died out into an oily, low-contrast gray, Matthew Finn felt the familiar, violent tug behind his right eyebrow, the distinct, physical ache of his eyes attempting to pull a single, coherent edge out of the darkness. Without the multi-layered lenses of his monocle, the forest ahead was a shifting, fluid tapestry of charcoal silhouettes and bleeding, violet shadows that seemed to expand and contract with every beat of his heart. He reached down into the deep pocket of his officer's coat, his gloved fingers brushing past the cold brass cylinders of his spare ammunition until they found the smooth, cylindrical shape of a small silver syringe casing. It was the first of the German neurostimulants Dr. Reyes had prepared, an amber venom that promised clarity at the expense of the pulse, and as his thumb hovered over the plunger, he could hear the faint, mechanical hiss-click of his brother's leg braces tracking 2 paces behind him, a constant reminder that the choice they had made tonight was already carved into the stone of the mountain behind them. The road ahead dipped into a narrow, limestone ravine where the trees grew so close together their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, shutting out what little ambient light remained in the European sky. Here, the mud was deep, rutted by the heavy treads of the supply trucks that had spent the last 3 months stripping the forward depots of everything from winter coats to synthetic fuel cells. It was a landscape defined by retreat, a gray kingdom of abandoned equipment, discarded ammunition crates, and the distinct, sour odor of damp wool and dysentery that followed every defeated army across the mud of the continent. Matthew stopped, raising a single, dark-gloved hand. Behind him, the 5 remaining members of the Crow unit dropped into the saturated ferns without a sound, their silhouettes vanishing instantly into the gray-on-black canvas of the ravine. "Thomas," Matthew whispered, his voice barely carrying past the high collar of his trench coat. "The bridge across the ends. The Germans said they left a staff car on the eastern approach." "Find it." Thomas did not reply aloud. 3 short, rhythmic clicks sounded through the throat microphones, followed by a sudden, sharp rush of displaced air as the boy launched himself from the lip of the ravine into the dark thicket above. The story of their defection was no longer a plan written on grease-stained maps in a French chateau. It was an active, ticking mechanism, and as Matthew turned his head to watch the bleeding purple shadow of his brother disappear into the tree line, he knew that the next 3 miles would determine whether they arrived in Stuttgart as generals of a new shadow army, or as 6 more unremembered bodies rotting in the German dirt.